They said luck was written into my bones from the day I was born. That I was a walking miracle, whoever married me would rise from the ashes, misfortune turning to fortune with just a touch of my hand. And in my last life, I believed it too. So, when Mrs. Eleanor Grant stood in front of me in her designer suit and said, "Samantha, as long as you're willing to marry our Nathaniel, this villa and 30 million will be your dowry. Plus, I'll donate 100 million to St. Joseph's orphanage," I nearly laughed out loud. It was all too familiar. I was the reincarnation of a koi fish, born with a rare fake congenital luck. In my previous life, marrying Nathaniel Nate Grant, the only heir of the Grant family empire in Manhattan, was supposed to save him from a deadly fate at 26. And it did. But instead of gratitude, I was met with hatred, humiliation, and eventually death. He told me, "Even without you, I could have survived my 26th birthday just fine. You just happened to appear. You seduced my mother into forcing this marriage on me. And because of you, the woman I loved, Rachel Moore, died in a drunk driving accident." He blamed me for everything. And on the night of his birthday, he stuffed me in a sack, tied a stone to my legs, and tossed me into the ocean like garbage. Didn't they say you were born with luck? Let's see if it saves you now. It didn't. I drowned. Now, here I was again. Back in this life. Back in this moment. The same living room. The same desperate offer from Mrs. Grant. Only this time, I smiled sweetly and said softly, "Mrs. Grant, I'm afraid my luck is nothing more than a marketing gimmick. I wouldn't dare ruin Mr. Grant's future." Nathaniel's eyes scanned me up and down with disgust. I've seen people like her before. All this coy reincarnation and natural-born luck stuff is just a scam. Even without her, I'll be fine. I'm not marrying some fake fortune charm. He was reborn too. I could see it in his eyes, hatred sharpened by memory. Just like me. In my past life, when Mrs. Grant begged me to marry Nate, she never mentioned Rachel Moore. I only agreed because I saw the dark cloud hanging over his head, literal death looming, and thought I could help. The betrothal gift was massive, the promise of $100 million donation too noble to refuse. So, I became Mrs. Grant on the day of Nate's 26th birthday. Rachel got drunk, heartbroken. She got behind the wheel, crashed, and killed multiple people. Her death destroyed families.
And he blamed me.
Not her. Not himself. He tortured me for years. Then killed me. So this time, I wasn't walking into that fire again. Mrs. Grant scolded him. "Nate, don't be so rude." She turned to me, trying to maintain her composure. "Please don't mind him. He just speaks his mind." Nate rolled his eyes. Since she already admitted she's a fake, why is she still here? Get her out of here before I do it myself. He turned to his mother, like a brat throwing a tantrum. "Mom, Rachel and I have been in love for 5 years. We're getting engaged next year." She went to St. Gabriel's Chapel to get a talisman for Mebelist by the head priest himself. "She'll be with me the entire time. I'll be fine." Mrs. Grant hesitated but eventually sighed and walked me to the door. Still clinging to hope, she asked, "Samantha, are you really not lucky? Not even a little?" I smiled gently. "Just a character my PR team came up with to sell some articles." Her face fell. I walked out of the Grant estate for the last time and hailed a cab. This time, I knew exactly where I was going. To someone who didn't see me as a curse or a commodity. We pulled up in front of a modern glass-walled villa overlooking the river. I stepped up and knocked. When the door opened, there he was, Ethan Blake. Still in a wheelchair, still calm, still handsome. "Mr. Blake," I said with a steady voice, "will you marry me?" His brows lifted in shock. "Miss Collins? We only ever met at the orphanage fundraiser." He wasn't wrong. But in my last life, he found me the night before my wedding to Nate. Quietly, gently, he said, "If you're short on money, I can wire you some privately. But marriage shouldn't be taken lightly. Nate has a temper. Mrs. Grant isn't who she pretends to be. You could suffer a lot." He was right. And when Nate imprisoned me, Ethan tried everything to get me out. But he was in a wheelchair, his company struggling, and he couldn't fight Nate's wrath. He died in a mysterious brake failure accident. I still remember Nate sneering, slapping my face with the back of a knife, whispering, I didn't think Ethan Blake would die for a liar. Now, standing in front of him again, I had only one goal. Change everything. He blinked at me, confused. Miss Collins, do you need a donation for the orphanage? I stepped forward. No, I need you. I'm not a commodity, I'm a person. But I am the reincarnation of a koi. Anyone who marries me will be blessed. Your life will turn around. Your health. Your business. Everything. He stared at me quietly, then smiled a little sad. Samantha, I'm disabled. I don't think I'm the right man for you. My eyes stung. 3 years ago, he was in a car accident saving an autistic child. That's how he lost his legs. Once the golden boy of the business world, now pitted, discarded. I stepped closer. What if I said I really, truly like you?
He didn't speak.
He just looked at me long and hard, searching for lies. But all I saw in his eyes was buried affection and deep, painful self-doubt. I leaned in and kissed him. His hand came up to hold the back of my head, his lips deepening the kiss, and when he pulled away, he whispered, Samantha Collins, if you choose me, don't you dare regret it. I didn't. That night, I fell for Ethan Blake.
Hard.
The next morning, he set a wedding date, Nate's 26th birthday. And this time, I'd be the one who lived. Ethan and I got our marriage license the following morning. The ink was still drying when he called his assistant and instructed him to wire $30 million to a joint account under my name and prepare the title for a villa in both our names. I told him I didn't want any of it, that being with him was enough, but he simply kissed my brow and said, You're my fiancée now, Samantha. You deserve everything I can give. His voice was steady, calm, but I could feel the heat in his palm as it held mine. It was trembling slightly, betraying how much this meant to him. He was the kind of man who didn't waste words, but made you feel every emotion in the quietest gestures. The wedding plans moved fast, and he let me choose everything: the venue, the colors, the flowers, without a single complaint. It was almost too perfect, too unreal, but I didn't let myself overthink it. For the first time, I felt safe. Until the day we went to the bridal boutique. I had barely stepped out of the dressing room when I heard that voice behind me, mocking, slick with contempt. A liar and a cripple. Perfect match. My heart chilled. I turned and saw him, Nathaniel Grant, smug in a designer coat, arm casually draped around Rachel Moore, whose face was painted with layers of smugness and contempt. She leaned into him like a delicate orchid, looking me up and down as if I were trash on the street. So this is the infamous Samantha Collins, she said with a sugary poison in her tone. I stared at her, calm but sharp. I never touched your man. And I certainly didn't beg for your position. Rachel smiled thinly and glanced at a rack of clearance gowns before snapping her fingers. Hey, salesgirl. Bring these over. I think they're more her style. She tossed the plastic-wrapped dresses at my feet like bones to a dog. I stood frozen, but Ethan rolled forward in his wheelchair, positioning himself in front of me like a shield. That's enough, he said, voice low and hard. Rachel Moore, Nathaniel, if you insult my fiancé again, I will not hesitate to take legal action. He wasn't loud, but every word cut through the air like steel. Even seated, Ethan had more dignity and power in him than Nate ever did standing. For a moment, even Nate was quiet, face stiff. Then, of course, he smirked. Ethan, we've known each other a long time. No need to make this uglier than it has to be. Actually, I have a suggestion. Rachel and I are holding our wedding at the Shenton Grand in 10 days. Why don't you two join us? Double wedding. Double the blessings, right? He smiled like a snake, offering an apple. It was bait, obvious and humiliating. Rachel gave a little laugh like a bell, leaning into him even harder. I could feel Ethan tense beside me, about to decline. But I gripped his hand and answered first.
Sure.
Let's see who really gets blessed that day. Nate's eyes gleamed, thinking he'd scored a win.
Great.
Let's hope good things come in pairs. As he turned away, he paused, stepped closer to me, and hissed under his breath, Don't think I'll let you mess up my life again. Even without you, I'll be just fine. You're nothing but a fraud, Samantha. Let's see how long Ethan keeps protecting you when the whole world sees who you really are. I ignored him and walked out with Ethan, but I felt his words clinging to my back like cobwebs. That night, Ethan was quiet, withdrawn. I teased him, joked, even tried feeding him ice cream, but he barely smiled. Finally, I asked, "Are you regretting marrying me already?" He shook his head but looked away. "It's not that. It's just when the wedding happens, everyone will see us side by side. I'll be in a wheelchair. He'll be standing, handsome, confident. Will you regret choosing me when the comparisons start?" I felt my heart ache. So that was Itha's pride, his fear. I crawled onto his lap, wrapped my arms around his neck, and kissed him over and over until I felt him melt into me, arms gripping me tight. "Ethan," I whispered against his lips, "Nathaniel Grant will never be half the man you are. And I don't care what anyone else thinks." He gave a soft laugh, half relieved, half disbelieving. "Liar. You just know how to sweet-talk me." "Then let me keep lying," I smiled, leaning into his chest as he stroked my hair. Over the next week, Ethan and I poured ourselves into planning. Every detail was ours. I chose lilac and ivory for the colors. He insisted on a string quartet. We had late-night cake tastings, debates over flower arrangements, and quiet moments where he'd look at me like I was something he never thought he'd deserve. Meanwhile, Nate and Rachel were busy parading themselves around every society event in New York. Rumors spread like wildfire. People were whispering that Nathaniel's doomed at 26 curse had been completely broken thanks to Rachel's talisman from St. Gabriel's Chapel. Others said I had been a con artist from the start, trying to marry into wealth with fake stories about being born lucky. Rachel even posted a veiled jab at me on her socials, calling out gold diggers who use spirituality as a brand, and posting a selfie with a saintly emoji and the words "blessed bride-to-be." I ignored it all until the text came. From an unknown number. "You destroyed my life before. You won't do it again. This time, Samantha, I'll expose you to the world. Nate." I stared at it for a long time, then calmly blocked the number. The storm was coming. But this time, I wasn't going to drown. This time, I was the tide. The day of the wedding arrived like a storm that had been brewing for lifetimes, thick with tension, whispers, and the weight of things unsaid. Nathaniel and Rachel stood at the entrance of the Shenton Grand in their tailored perfection, greeting guests with wide smiles and hollow warmth, while I arrived a few minutes later, dressed in a gown Ethan had personally picked with me, simple but elegant, holding myself with the kind of calm that only comes from dying once and living again. Nate's eyes landed on me first, his smirk sharpening as he scanned the crowd, then asked mockingly, "Where's Ethan? Don't tell me your fiancé bailed on his own wedding." I stared at him evenly and replied, "He's on his way," and though Nate rolled his eyes like he didn't believe me, I didn't flinch. Rachel stood beside him, beaming in a designer wedding dress that glittered obscenely under the chandeliers, laughing behind her hand as if the sight of me alone was entertainment. Around us, the guests began murmuring some too loudly. I could hear them, the so-called friends of the Grants and more family. "Isn't she the one who got kicked out of the grand engagement? Didn't she say she had some kind of magic luck? Well, where's her groom now?" Maybe he wised up. I stood there, listening, breathing, watching the facade they all clung to like children clinging to fairy tales, until suddenly the front doors of the hotel swung open with a gust of wind, and Ethan entered, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, walking not wheeling step by steady step, cane in one hand, pride in his spine, and every soul in that hall went silent. Someone gasped. Another dropped their champagne flute. I turned to him slowly, my chest aching from the rush of emotion that pulsed through me. He crossed the space between us like a man reborn and took my hand in his, pressing a kiss to my fingers like I was the only thing tethering him to this world. "Sorry I'm late," he whispered with a small smile. "Had to make sure I could walk down the aisle with you." And then chaos began not from us, but from the other side of the room. Nate was clutching his neck, crying out in confusion as the peace amulet from St. Gabriel's Chapel that had been resting against his skin began to smoke without warning, and within seconds, burst into flame. He screamed, tore it off, and dropped it to the marble floor where it burned to ash before anyone could react. The guests panicked. Rachel was screaming, "Mrs. Grant turned pale. The chandeliers above flickered once, then twice, then the one directly above Nate groaned and came crashing down. People shrieked, scattering like birds. Nate dove to the side just in time, glass shattering inches from his skull, blood trickling from a cut across his cheek. The MC fainted. I didn't move. Ethan didn't either. We stood quietly, watching everything unravel like it was preordained, like fate was finally collecting its debts. But it didn't stop there. The heavy velvet curtains behind Nate suddenly caught fire. The flames spread like wild vengeance, climbing toward him, ignoring physics or reason. He tried to run, stumbled, and fell. Mrs. Grant wailed, begging the staff to pour water over her son. And when it was done, when Nate was left soaked, singed, and trembling on the floor like a broken scarecrow, pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed, "It's you. You curse me. You've always been jealous." Ethan stepped between us before Nate could get close, but it was almost funny because just as Nate lunged forward, he slipped on a puddle of spilled champagne and landed flat on his face. The universe was making a statement, and it wasn't done. A jagged piece of broken crystal jutted from the floor near his neck, barely missing his carotid. "Mrs. Grant kicked it away with shaking legs and finally whispered in horror, maybe the fortune teller was right. Maybe he really wasn't supposed to live past 26. Then, as if summoned by the madness, the head priest from St. Gabriel's chapel arrived. Father Gabriel, solemn in his golden robes, entered the wreckage of the ballroom with a face carved from stone. He looked at Nate once, then turned to me, and I saw the recognition, the realization, the fear. He fell to his knees and said in a trembling voice, "This woman, she is the one. The reincarnated vessel of divine fortune. Only by marrying her can this calamity be resolved." And just like that, every eye in the room turned to Menet with ridicule this time, but with awe, desperation, hunger. Mrs. Grant, her pride shattered, dropped to her knees and grabbed the hem of my dress. "Samantha, please. I was wrong. I'll give you everything, money, houses, donations, 30 million more if you want. Just save my son. Marry him. Right now." Ethan's jaw tensed beside me. "Mrs. Grant," he said coldly, "Samantha is my wife. Trying to steal her in front of me, isn't that beneath you?" I put a hand on his arm to steady him and said, "It's okay. I'll agree. But only on 2 conditions." Everyone went still. Mrs. Grant nodded quickly, babbling promises. "Yes, anything, just say it." I pointed at Nate and said, "I want him to kneel and kowtow 3 times. Each time, he has to say he was wrong." Nate looked like he'd swallowed poison. "You're insane," he spat, but the moment he moved, his foot slipped again, and he crashed face first into the floor, blood seeping from a new wound. Mrs. Grant, sobbing, turned to him. "Please, baby. For your life. Just do it. Just this once. Do what she asks." Nate's face twisted with hate and humiliation, but under my gaze, he finally knelt, gritted his teeth, and said it 3 times. "I was wrong." With each word, a piece of his pride died. But I wasn't done. "Second condition," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I want you to look Ethan in the face and say, Nathaniel Grant is not as good as Ethan Blake. Say it 3 times." Nate choked, then finally croaked it out, each word dragging across his tongue like broken glass. I smiled politely, then reached into my purse and pulled out 2 crisp red marriage certificates. "Sorry," I said sweetly. "We already got married yesterday." Nate stared at me, stunned, then clutched his chest and collapsed. The wedding ended not with a toast, but with an ambulance. The guests scattered. Business partners fled. And in that single night, the once golden Grant family began to rot from the inside out. And I didn't feel the slightest bit of pity. The fallout from the wedding disaster spread faster than champagne stains on silk, and within 24 hours, the Grant family's business reputation crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. Investors pulled out, tabloids spun every angle of the cursed birthday groom, and online forums dubbed Nathaniel Grant the doomed groom of Manhattan. The strangest part? No one could explain how the chandelier fell or why the peace amulet burst into flames. But the less they understood, the more they speculated, and in the court of public opinion, Nate became a walking black hole of bad luck. Meanwhile, Ethan and I returned home in silence, our hands entwined, our hearts still thudding from the madness we'd just walked through. We didn't say much that night, just held each other as the city moved on outside our windows. The next morning, while I was still sipping coffee in the kitchen, Ethan turned to me with that calm, thoughtful expression I had come to recognize as a prelude to something serious. "Samantha," he said, "if what Father Gabriel said is true, if you really were born with a lucky soul, then that makes you a target. People like Nate aren't the only ones who believe in this stuff. The higher up you go, the more they'll want to use you." I looked at him, heart tight with the truth of his words, but smiled anyway. "So what are you saying? That you regret marrying trouble?" He leaned over, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "I'm saying I'll burn down the world before I let anyone take you from me." That should have been our peace, our moment of stillness, but fate wasn't done yet. That afternoon, while Ethan was packing for a short business trip, the doorbell rang with a kind of frantic urgency that made my skin crawl. The housekeeper answered and returned moments later, clearly shaken. "Miss Collins, it's Rachel Moore. She's outside, and she's not well." I stepped out, expecting another performance, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Rachel, kneeling on the front steps, her forehead bloody from repeated knocks against the concrete, sobbing uncontrollably. "It's all my fault," she cried, her voice broken and hoarse. "If I hadn't forced him to marry me, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe he wouldn't be dying." I froze. "What do you mean dying?" Rachel trembled harder. "He's still in the hospital. They've brought in every specialist, even called in shamans and spiritual healers. But nothing's working. Every ritual ends in disaster. People vomiting blood, sacred items breaking on their own. Everyone says the same thing: only someone with a coy fate can save him, and that person has to marry him immediately." I stared at her unmoved, and she crawled closer, grasping my dress. "Please. You can divorce Ethan tomorrow. Just do this to save his life. I'll never beg again. This is the only time." I shook my head slowly. Even if I wanted to, it wouldn't work. I can only protect one person in this life. I've already chosen Ethan. The bond has been sealed. Rachel's eyes widened with panic. "That's not fair. You knew the truth. He was cursed, and you let him walk into it." Her voice cracked into a scream. "Everyone wants to marry Nate. Do you know how lucky you were to have the chance? He only rejected you because you were poor. Why can't you just give him this one thing?" Her hands clawed at me then, desperate and wild, and within seconds, the security team Ethan had discreetly arranged was on her, dragging her out while she kicked and wailed like a banshee. I stood there watching, hollow and tired, thinking how ironic it was that in both lives, Rachel hated me not because I did anything to her but because I existed. And now, because I refused to kill myself saving a man who murdered me, I was the villain in her mind. I shut the door slowly, leaving the past on the other side of the lock. Word about Nate's condition went quiet after that. The Grant stopped posting, stopped appearing, and the media grew bored. But the whispers didn't stop. They just moved into darker corners. And then, news surfaced not about Nate, but about Rachel. Mrs. Grant had canceled their engagement.
Publicly.
Brutally. On the steps of their estate, she tossed Rachel's dowry onto the ground and spat venom like a woman possessed. "If it weren't for you, my son would have married Samantha long ago, and none of this would have happened. You cursed us. You're the reason our family's falling apart. If he dies, I'll drag you to hell with him." People recorded it, posted it. Rachel's reputation burned to ash overnight. Meanwhile, Ethan and I continued forward. The Blake family business surged. Deals came faster than we could count, and Ethan joked that maybe my luck really was real after all. We planned a short honeymoon, just somewhere quiet and private, but before we could leave, Ethan had to fly out for a critical negotiation that could bring in a contract worth hundreds of millions. I kissed him goodbye at the airport, my heart full, and returned home alone, already dreaming about the future we were building. But when I walked into the house, it was too quiet. The guards were missing. The lights flickered. And before I could scream, something sharp struck the back of my head, and the world went black. I woke up in a place I recognized instantly, the same warehouse where I'd once been threatened in my past life. Only this time, I was tied to a chair with blood crusted in my hair and a cold, deathly stillness in the air. Then I saw him, Nathaniel Grant. Except he was no longer the man I had once married. His skin was gray, paper-thin, with lesions creeping across his neck like rot. His eyes were sunken and burning, and every breath he took sounded like death itself trying to crawl out of his chest. He grinned when he saw me. Samantha Collins. So it's true. You were reborn too. I met his gaze with cold fury.
Yes.
And I remember everything, including how you murdered me. He chuckled, though it turned into a ragged cough. Funny, isn't it? The fortune teller was right all along. I thought it was all superstition, just something to scare my mother into opening her wallet. But I really am dying. Tumors everywhere. The doctors say I have a week. Maybe less. His expression shifted, twisted into something feral. But I figured if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. Because no matter the lifetime, you always ruin me. Always. He lunged forward, his hands wrapping around my throat, and I struggled, rage flaring through me like fire. You're insane, I gasped. I never married you in this life. It's not my fault. You did this to yourself. His grip tightened. Maybe. But you married Ethan. And that's worse. Ever since we were kids, people compared me to him. And when I finally beat him, when I crippled him, I thought I won. But then you came. You healed him. You made him powerful again. So now I'll take you away. And he'll lose everything all over again. I clawed at him, kicked, thrashed, my vision dimming, and then a shot rang out. Blood splattered across my face. Nate's hands went limp, and he fell sideways, eyes wide in shock, a bullet through his skull. Police burst into the room behind him. Ethan ran to me, untying my hands, crushing me in his arms. It's over, he said, his voice shaking. It's over, Samantha. You're safe now. And for the first time in 2 lives, I truly believed it. After Nathaniel's body was taken away and the chaos began to quiet, Ethan wouldn't let go of me for hours, as if every second apart risked losing me again, and I didn't argue, didn't speak, just pressed myself into his arms and listened to the steady thump of his heart until the trembling in my hands finally stopped, until the paramedics finished their checkups and the crime scene tape went up, and the police confirmed what we already knew: he was beyond saving, physically ravaged by terminal cancer, psychologically consumed by obsession and hatred, and in the end, he'd fallen exactly as fate had warned, alone and unloved, desperate to take me down with him, and yet failed again, just like in the life before. Only this time I had someone who came for me, someone who never let go, and as the sun rose the next day over our quiet estate, I found myself sitting in the kitchen again, holding Ethan's hand as he gently traced his thumb over my bandaged wrist, his eyes stormy with worry. And finally he said it, softly but firmly. I want to move you out of the country for a while, somewhere safer, somewhere quiet just until things die down. And though I knew he was right, knew that the headlines were still spinning, that people still whispered about the woman born with a Coy's fate and the man who defied death, I shook my head and smiled because I wasn't running anymore, not when I'd finally taken back my life. And so instead we poured our energy into rebuilding, reclaiming the narrative, cutting ties with everyone who ever tried to use me, and most of all, healing, because trauma doesn't vanish just because the villain dies. It lingers, shadows clinging to the edges of joy, and yet day by day, with Ethan's patience and my stubbornness, we reclaimed peace, and ironically, as if my supposed lucky fate was waking up from a long slumber, everything around us began to blossom. Blake Holdings doubled in value in less than 3 months. Charities we touched went viral with massive fundraising, and even Ethan's physical therapy progressed faster than any doctor had predicted, to the point where he stopped needing the cane entirely and began jogging again, laughing like a teenager when he reached his first mile. And somewhere in the middle of all that, on an ordinary Tuesday morning while we were painting the nursery in our new home in upstate New York, he slid his arms around my waist from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder, murmuring with a low grin, "You know, it would be nice if she had your eyes." And I turned, wide-eyed, blurting, "She," and he nodded, looking down at my stomach where the faintest curve had begun to show, a secret we hadn't even told our parents yet. And in that moment the world stopped. The grief and pain and all the things that once haunted me falling away like dead leaves in autumn, and all I could think was, this is what survival looks like. This is what real love builds, not wealth, not revenge, not even safety, but a future. And as Ethan kissed the side of my head, whispering the thousandth version of, I hope it's a girl, I laughed through my tears and finally let the past go. We named her Lily, not because of the flower, but because of what it symbolized: rebirth, purity, and peace. Everything I thought I'd never be allowed to have in this lifetime, and when I held her for the first time, so small and warm against my chest, her heartbeat fluttering like a secret promise, I realized that all the pain, all the betrayal, all the death and desperation I'd clawed through it had all led here, to this fragile miracle that smelled like milk and safety and second chances. And Ethan cried when he held her, not loud, just silent tears slipping down his cheeks as he kissed her forehead and said, "You saved me twice, Sam. Once when you said yes, and now with her." And in that moment, I knew the curse had ended. Not Nate's curse, not the prophecy, not the karma that clung to the Grant name, but mine. The deep-rooted fear that I was only ever meant to be someone else's tool, someone's scapegoat, someone whose value depended on what I could bring others. And now, sitting in the rocking chair in our sun-drenched nursery, with Lily sleeping in my arms and Ethan brushing her hair back with the gentlest fingers I'd ever seen, I could finally believe that I was allowed to want more, to hope, to build instead of survive. And while the world outside hadn't stopped whispering, because of course they hadn't, because people loved legends and nothing fed gossip like a woman with a lucky fate, they no longer mattered. Not when the Blake name had become untouchable, not when Ethan's empire grew larger by the day, not when my face, once splashed across scandal blogs and whispered about in charity galas, now graced the cover of magazines as the woman who turned fate into fortune. And though I never confirmed or denied the coy rumor, never played into it again, those who knew, and the ones who didn't could only wonder how a girl from nowhere ended up with the man everyone thought would never rise again. But what they didn't see, what they could never understand, was what it cost to win, that behind every success was blood and ash, that before I became Samantha Blake, the woman who built empires with her touch, I had to die as Samantha Collins, the woman who was thrown away for being inconvenient. And sometimes when the wind held a certain way at night or a headline about Nate resurfaced, I'd remember the salt water filling my lungs, the weight of the stone tied to my feet, the feeling of betrayal so deep it had no words, and I'd pull Lily closer, kiss her soft little head, and remind myself that I was no longer drowning, that the water would never rise above me again, because I had rebuilt my life, brick by brick with my own hands, with a man who never saw me as a myth but as a person, flawed and wounded and worth loving. And as Ethan wrapped his arm around me and whispered, "Let's have another," half serious, half playful, I couldn't help but laugh, because maybe, just maybe, this was what happy endings looked like. Not the perfect fairy tale, not the riches or applause, but the quiet knowledge that you made it out alive and loved deeper because you'd once been shattered.